So thank you very much for the invitation. So as Hannah was presenting me, I'm assistant professor at the Aalto University School of Business. And basically my area of expertise focuses on sustainability management. So I have to say, I don't know that much about the shipping industry, but I noticed that when you were presenting yourself, a lot of you had interest in something related to sustainability. So I think we can find a lot of common ground in regards to this. And I will also tell shortly about my research interest more broadly. So of course, this is a very broad field, sustainability management. So some of the other interest or some of the more specific interest areas I have are, for example, energy transitions, which I will talk about today, circular economy, specifically circular economy governance. We have, for example, a large project now that focuses on circular economy in the textile sector. And also I have a general interest in different types of collaborative organization and collaborative form for sustainability, as well as sustainable business models. And I've been at Aalto University now for roughly 4 years or so. Before that, I was also working in Aalto University, which is in Eastern Finland. And also during my postdoc, I spent a part of that time in Harvard University in the Weatherhead Center. And well, that's shortly my background. So basically, I also mentioned a little bit about our university. So basically, Aalto University School of Business is a relatively large business school. We have about 3,600 students. Here you can see the photo of our new business school, which we moved to roughly 2 years ago. More broadly, Aalto has basically 3 key focus areas. So the School of Business is one of them, and then we also have the school engineering as well as arts. So it's basically quite a multidisciplinary university. So I apologize if there is some kind of inconsistencies on my slides, because basically about 15 minutes before the start of the seminar, I don't know what happened in my PowerPoint, but I lost a few slides that I was kind of finalizing previously. So this just gives me gives a reminder to keep backups of our work. Also, before we go into the topic, I just wanted to briefly present our research group. So the research group I'm involved with is it's kind of like an informal research group, probably a bit similar to I don't know, is your shipping research group kind of like a formal organization within the GRI, or is it more like an informal research group? But at least in the case of our sustainability group, where this is kind of an informal research group from various different departments at the university. And some of the topics that we're focusing on, you can see here, it's circular economy, innovation for sustainability, energy transition has been a big area, as well as this innovation for poverty alleviation. So we've also had some projects in that area. The general purposes of corporate responsibility. Okay, so that was kind of a brief background about myself, as well as Aalto University and our research group. So now I'll then go over into the main topic of today. So as I mentioned earlier, I don't have that much experience with the shipping industry, but I think this research that my colleagues and I have done in relation to the energy sector is something that perhaps a lot of these findings might also have implications in the shipping industry, specifically when it comes to the legitimacy of new energy technologies and, for example, shipping propulsion technologies. So we're all pretty much familiar with the fact that the energy sector has been under turmoil in the last decade or so, at least. So basically, it's one of the largest contributors to climate change. And in order to curb the climate change impacts or meet the Paris Climate Agreement targets, we basically need to invest a lot in the energy system. So roughly a doubling of the share of carbon-free energy required every 5 to 7 years or so. So this was a figure from the Rockström article a few years back. And basically, we've seen also a lot of these social movements against, for example, fossil fuel firms. Here's one example from the new coal-powered plant that was opened in Germany last year. This was actually the Finnish firm Fortum acquired Uniper, which was the owner of this particular coal plant. So this was also in the headlines quite a lot in Finland due to, for example, Fortum having quite a strong strategic vision towards renewable energy, but then also investing so much into coal-powered energy production at this stage. So this is also something that is very much relevant to the topic of today. And we've seen, for example, some divestment movements from insurance companies. For example, here, it's from the French insurance company AXA. I think the part of the title is missing here. And here's also kind of a telling quote from a European coal industry representative from the Paris Climate Agreement, that we will be hated and vilified in the same way that slave traders were once hated and vilified. So I will basically present the findings of two studies that are really, quite a big interlink. So this first study that Hannah also mentioned focuses on legitimacy and legitimation strategies in the energy sector. And I will focus mostly on this study because I think this is a bit more relevant, or more broadly relevant to that could apply also in the shipping industry. And I will also briefly talk about the second study towards the end of my presentation. But basically, as I was discussing in the previous slide, there's basically been drastic changes in the way that these energy generation technologies are perceived. If you go back, for example, to just 10 years or so, the situation was quite different. So new renewable technologies such as wind and solar have been quickly gaining legitimacy and market acceptance. So for example, they presented more than half of the new power capacity investments in 2015, and the trend has continued also since then. And also, as we saw with these, for example, these divestment movements and this social movement against the fossil fuels, these non-renewable technologies have been quickly losing legitimacy. So the research questioning this particular study was it focused on that how do these energy incumbents, so these energy utilities that have been operating in this sector for a longer time, how do they use rhetorical strategies to justify their new investments in these conventional legitimacy losing technologies, as well as these more novel legitimacy gaining technologies, particularly under this situation of considerable institutional change. So if I can kind of briefly reflect on like this institutional studies within the management field. So this has been basically the institutional theory is something that is very prominent in organization studies, particularly in the management field. And this idea of legitimacy is, for example, one subtopic within institutional study that has received quite a lot of research interest. So what is basically interesting about energy utilities is that they're facing this choice that they can invest either in clean or these polluting technologies, although there's this powerful social movement against, for example, investing in fossil fuels. But they also face a lot of uncertainty. So this energy transition threatens their centralized energy generation business model. So it's they need to change the way that they operate as they switch to the new renewable technologies. So briefly about theoretical background, as I mentioned here, the kind of subfield of institutional studies that this is based on is legitimation, and specifically how these incumbents act under institutional change. So they often engage in this legitimation context in order to protect their interest in the field and, for example, defend against new market entrants. And also in regards to technology legitimacy, these often are kind of legitimated by borrowing from the what we know is that they're legitimated by borrowing from the cognitively accepted aspects of the existing technologies. For example, in a study of Edison and how he invented the light bulb, this one particular study found that basically to legitimate this technology, he drew on some features of the existing lighting system in order to make the new technology more familiar for the audiences, so it would have better market acceptance. And a particular subfield of legitimation strategies looks at how actors use rhetorics in order to legitimate their actions and, for example, new investments. So this basically looks at how text can be used to persuade an evaluator in order to gain legitimacy. So the particular framework that we used in this study was these 4 different rhetorical strategies that have been identified in previous research. So rationalization strategy focuses on, for example, referring to utility or benefits of a particular practice. And then normalization strategies in turn focuses on some kind of, for example, past or normal actions in order to legitimate the action. And again, moralization strategies usually refer to some kind of moral value basis or norms in order to legitimate the action. And lastly, these authorization references appeal to some type of authority, for example, a rule or an expert, to legitimate the action. So what we did in this study was we did a content analysis of press releases of these energy incumbents. So here's just a brief overview of the study. So we basically collected roughly a bit less than 500 press releases from different energy utilities. This time frame that this study focused on was 2010 to 2015, which was kind of like the start of the more rapid adoption of new renewable energy technologies. And we basically did both a qualitative and a quantitative analysis of these press releases. So first we coded roughly a third of them, qualitatively identifying different themes. And then we performed this quantitative computer-aided content analysis to look at the prevalence of these themes across the whole data set of 500 or so press releases. So let's look at the kind of details that how did this mixed method content analysis work? So through this qualitative analysis, I don't know, are you able to see my pointer here? But basically on the left side, you see these main rhetorical strategies, which I mentioned previously. And then we identified specific themes from the qualitative analysis. So in this case, this rationalization type of strategies included, for example, reference to performance of a technology. For example, it could be a power plant that is, for example, more efficient than an existing technology. Or other types included, for example, a reference to profitability or customers or even the technological novelty of the investment. And then these normalization strategies that we found were basically related to the strategy of the company. So for example, alignment with the existing strategy of the firm, or linked to the growth strategy of the firm, or then also more specific references, for example, the portfolio of the firm or diversification strategies. And then for the moralization strategies, we identified that there were 2 distinct clusters of themes that related to both the environmental aspects as well as the community and societal aspects. And then lastly, for the authorization strategies, these were more focused on the regulatory aspects of the investment. So for example, regulatory approval or specific support schemes. And the way that we did the quantitative content analysis, you can see that we formed these dictionaries for these specific themes, and then we quantified the occurrence of the words in these dictionaries across the data set of these press releases. So here's a little bit about the results of the quantitative analysis. This basically, as I said, this shows the prevalence of these themes across the data set, and I can pick out some specific important numbers from here. So as we were basically interested in how does this rhetoric look in comparison between the non-renewable investments and the renewable investments, we found that some interesting differences. So somewhat intuitively, we could, as we could expect, these rationalization strategies were more strongly linked with the non-renewable investments. So for example, a lot of the arguments could relate to the fact that even if a new gas or coal-powered plant is polluting, it's still more efficient, for instance, than an even older technology in that particular type. Or they could, for example, reference to benefits to the customers, such as lower costs, or, for example, the novelty of the particular technology. So these were more strongly linked to the non-renewable investments. And interestingly, we also identified that these environmental arguments, which we would expect to see more often with renewable investments, they were actually used more often with the non-renewable investments, which was somewhat surprising for us. So this is again the example I used previously, that for example, a plant could be argued to be environmentally friendly relative to an even more polluting technology. And then what we also found was interesting is that these normalization strategies that mainly refers to strategy, these were used more strongly in association with renewable investments. So even if these firms were simultaneously investing in both types of technologies, they were more strongly arguing that their strategic interests lie in the renewable technologies. So at the end, we also did this type of co-occurrence analysis that looks at how often these rhetorical strategies are used within the same sentence. So again, we found some interesting differences here in regards to the technology. So we saw that in the case of these non-renewables, what these incumbents did, that they would often combine these rationalization strategies and link them also with this authorization and moralization strategies. So this type of, for example, arguing both for the economic and the environmental benefits at the same time. And then in regards to the renewables, we identified that these co-occurrences between the normalization strategies were somewhat stronger than in the case of the non-renewables. So for example, they could combine this with the moralization strategies to say that the strategy of the firm is to, for example, aim for a more sustainable future. So there are these strategy and sustainability related arguments within the same sentence. So we theorized on this idea of these co-occurring rhetorical strategies by elaborating this concept of basically this rhetorical blending strategies. So we saw that in the case of this legitimacy losing technology, so in this case, the non-renewables, there we identified what we call this pragmatic blending. So here's one example of this, that, for example, this advanced clean coal technology. So again, we can ask, what is clean coal if we're talking about climate change, and we know what are the impacts of coal-based power production in terms of the impacts to climate change. So this combined basically this rationalization with the environmental or the community aspects of these moralization strategies. So basically focused more on the economics and the sustainability. Whereas then on the renewable investments, we identified what we call these visionary blending strategies. So basically this combination of these normalization strategies that focus on the strategic aspects with the sustainability aspects. So for example, emphasizing this sustainability, the sustainable future of the company, or for example, provision of energy, or the societal benefits of the provision of energy. Okay, so coming to the end of this first study, what we basically theorize here is that these rhetorical blending strategies can be seen as an indicator of when this institutional change process within a given field reaches this point of when this new value base becomes more established, and there starts to be this serious threat of losing legitimacy for the old technology. So we theorize that this is the kind of point where we start to see this rhetorical blending strategies. And then in regards to this incumbents and how they act during the drastic institutional change, we also think that this has implication in terms of how can these firms legitimate their ambidextrous strategy. So when they invest both in the old as well as the new technologies at the same time. And this is how they can basically legitimize these dual strategies to their audiences. And yeah, basically the last point refers to this also basically, we can theorize on the dynamics of this technology legitimacy in regards to how these rhetorical blending strategies would affect it. So it's possible that they can, at the same time, they can boost the legitimacy of the new technologies, and it's possible that they may then perhaps slow down the legitimacy losing process of the old technologies, but it's also possible that this might backfire on the incumbents in a way that this might even lead to a more rapid shift of values in regards to a particular institutional field. Okay, so I've also then shortly introduced the second study, which is sort of a follow-up to this study in regards to that it looks also at the actions of this energy incumbents and uses some of the same data, but it's a quite a bit different study in the sense that it doesn't look at these rhetorical strategies, but rather the concrete actions, the new investments of these firms, and what are the characteristics that are driving those new energy investments. So in this case, we basically focused more on theory from international business. And so this is a relatively new study that just came out early this year in the Journal of International Business Studies. And we basically were interested in that as these energy incumbents, they're basically, many of them are global firms, and they also engage in foreign direct investments. We were interested in what is the role of these, what kind of factors affect these foreign direct investments. So these can have a large role also to, for example, accelerate the energy transition in the sense that they can, for example, improve technology transfer between countries. So our research question here was that how do these firm characteristics, so the characteristics of the investing firm, as well as the institutional environment of the host country of the foreign direct investment, how do these jointly influence the energy incumbents' investment strategies? So here is a kind of overview of what we know from current understanding in the field of international business. But one area of interest there has been these firm-specific advantages, which are basically advantages of a firm over its competitors that allow it to invest in a particular country, whereas then country-specific advantages refer to the advantages of a specific host country of a foreign direct investment, and why a firm that basically influence why a firm would want to invest in there. So we identified 6 different factors that might be relevant in here. So in regards to the firm, is the technological capabilities, their existing technology base, their share of state ownership, as well as their accumulated international experience. And then in regards to this country-specific advantages, we identified the market growth of the host country, the institutional environment, in regards to, for example, renewable support, or basically sustainability activities in more general, as well as direct incentives for renewable energy that these are the key relevant factors that we want to study here. So what we did was basically a configurational approach, QCA, so qualitative comparative analysis, which basically is a method to identify causal complexity. When you have a situation that is characterized, for example, by several different pathways that might lead to the same outcome, or for example, you have interrelated causal factors that might affect each other. So this is a situation where configurational studies such as QCA can be offer certain benefits over, for example, more traditional quantitative approaches. So again, we had some of the same firms. I'm not going to go over the whole same process again, but in this case, what we were interested in was these subsidiaries of these firms. So basically this pair of a firm and the host country that it invested in. And we had a total of 84 of these in our data set. So that is, in our case, it was one case in a QCA. So we had 84 of these cases. And here's a short overview of the QCA model. Here you can see these conditions that I mentioned previously, the firm-specific and the country-specific conditions, as well as then the data sources and the measures that we used for these. So maybe something I can highlight here is that the outcome that we observe here, so these were the 6 conditions which I already mentioned earlier, but the outcome was basically the capacity investment of the firm in a particular country as a percentage of the firm's total energy generating capacity. So it also accounted for the relative size differences of these subsidiaries in that way. And we coded renewable investments as positive and non-renewables as negative, as we were interested in the kind of transition degree of a particular subsidiary. So here's an overview of the findings. If you've seen QCA studies before, you've probably seen these bubble charts, which basically, or this is the usual way to illustrate QCA results. So basically the solid circles represent conditions that are absent, conditions that are present, and the circles with a cross present conditions that are absent. And the idea is that you have these configurations of these present and absent conditions that may lead to a particular outcome. You see overall that there's 5 columns at the top. So the first, 9 columns at the top. So the first 5 are the ones that lead to a positive outcome. In this case, subsidiaries that have predominantly renewable investments. And the last 4 are those that led to a negative outcome. So subsidiaries that had predominantly non-renewable investments. And some of the interesting things that I can highlight in here is that if you look at these, the first 5 columns, so the positive configurations, you can see that if you look at the state ownership, there's basically 3 distinct configurations that are linked to privately owned firms and 2 that are linked to publicly owned firms. And these 2 look quite different in the sense that these first 3, which are the ones that have privately owned firms, are basically relying more on their technological capabilities and their international experience. While the last R4 and R5, so the ones that have mainly the state-owned firms, are relying more on the country-specific factors. So, for example, demand growth or public incentives. And then also, if you look at the state-owned firms, there's another 2 configurations on the right side in R3 and in R4, which have been focusing more on the non-renewable investments. If you look at the difference between those and the R4 and R5, you notice that actually more internationalized state-owned firms have been engaging in more non-renewable investments, while the less internationalized firms have been operating more in the renewable sector. So this was actually something that we thought was quite counterintuitive. So coming to the end of this second study, a brief discussion of what we identified through this QCA study. So we saw that there's quite different strategies for these privately owned firms and these state-owned enterprises. So these privately owned firms generally have quite high internationalization and existing renewable capabilities, and they may also invest despite the country advantages being absent. Whereas the state-owned firms invest in, they have generally lower internationalization and these technological capabilities, and they also favor more lower risk target countries. And as I mentioned previously, what we thought was also quite counterintuitive, that these less internationalized state-owned firms are more likely to invest in renewables. And this is actually quite the opposite that has been identified in this field before, where generally it's been thought that these very global firms face high sustainability pressures, and therefore they're more likely to engage in sustainability activities. So what we thought that in the case of state-owned firms, it might be that they are perhaps more shielded from international pressures, as they're predominantly owned by the state. And for example, then these, for example, pressures that affect the publicly listed companies don't necessarily apply to them in the same way. And overall, also this study shows the joint impact of these institutional and firm conditions to this kind of a configurational analysis that hasn't been used in this this context previously. Okay, so this is basically the last slide of my presentation, but I was also thinking about that what could be the potential implications for the shipping industry if you compare what we found in these studies to the, for example, the sustainability pressures in the shipping industry. So, for example, what is the kind of stage of energy transition in regards to shipping propulsion technologies? Do the legitimacy issues that we identified, are they different in the case of these energy utilities versus then energy technologies in the shipping industry? And also I was thinking about the kind of role of the shipping industry in these fossil fuel supply chains. So what are the kind of implications of that in terms of that, what would be their strategies in the energy transition? And I was also thinking that in the case of these energy utilities, the technological lock-in plays quite a large role, because they're locked into this kind of centralized energy production system. And that's kind of one of the key threats why they don't necessarily want to invest in the renewable technology. So what are the kind of factors related to lock-in in the shipping industry? And then also thinking about this second study, so how do these characteristics of the particular firm in the shipping industry, and for example, what countries it's operating in, might those have an certain type of impact in this particular industry? Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions about these studies, I would certainly like to hear more. If you have any kind of questions or comments, or for example, reflections or how this might look in the shipping industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Samuli. This was great, and for me, who has already been a bit acquainted with at least the first of your papers, I see a lot of similarities and things that we can learn from, but I would like to open the floor to the rest of you guys first, so that you have a chance to ask Samuli, or if you want to bring up anything for discussion. It's very silent. No, no comments. No, but I think it was very interesting, because I think that a few of the questions that you brought up on your last slide is actually one of the questions. Or Carl, did you have a question? I saw that you unmuted.
I was just thinking about what is your advice for getting the transition to actually happen? Can you see that from your material? Is it that we need specific sort of incentives or tax or yeah. Do you have any takeaways about that?
I think the second study in particular might be relevant to that. So we thought, we saw definitely that the environment, so for example, the particular incentives or the kind of larger, broader institutional environment related to this energy transition definitely played a role. But in the case, for example, of these privately owned firms, it wasn't entirely necessary. So we saw that those firms were also able to invest despite not having any of these country-specific advantages. So it was simply a kind of a business as usual for them. They already had quite a large familiarity with the renewable technologies. They also were investing in these more higher growth countries, and they also had high international experience. So it was kind of they were able to leverage, for example, some of that. Let's say, like maybe to use more specific examples, that we identified there were quite a few of these Southern European energy utilities that had often developed this kind of strong technological base in their home country that they were then able to leverage in many of their other markets. So definitely this both kind of the support from the public as well as the characteristics of the firm have a key role to play there. And I think, like, if you think about it from a broader systemic perspective, these social movements and basically other types of actors that are focused on the legitimacy of these technologies and campaigning for this energy transition, for instance, I think those are an important part of it as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, Simon, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I don't have a straight line of thought here, but I'm gonna start talking and see if something happens. No, but I thought that the part of the kind of the rhetorics and the way people use familiar categories, I think that is quite interesting. And I recognize that I had a previous project on risk and nanotechnology. Mm-hmm. And that was a very common strategy to kind of say that this is just this is just carbon, or like using familiar categories. And the people like producing nanosilica, for example, would kind of stress, yeah, but this has been existing in nature, in the glaciers in Iceland, and people have been bathing in these in like for generations, and so that using familiar technology, and that kind of that kind of led my question to it. And I've been reading a bit about kind of acceptance for nuclear energy, and I was, did you include anything of that in your study?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. I think nuclear is specifically a technology where this kind of dynamic of legitimacy is really interesting, in a sense that it's a carbon-free technology, in a sense that it could be in this sense a kind of a positive impact to the energy transition, but at the same time it has the relatively strong legitimacy issues that relate to other parts of the impacts of nuclear energy, so waste disposal and potential of disasters and so forth. So we did have a few investments related to it. Was actually numerically a very small amount, obviously, because the amount of new nuclear investments has been relatively small in the past decade or so. And most of our investments that we found were particularly in the Western countries and, for example, North America, Europe, and some South American countries as well. But there's not so much, for example, on China, for instance, that has been investing a lot in nuclear. But in this case, we included them in the same category as the fossil fuels, so non-renewable. That's why we use this term, because we thought that the legitimacy issues that nuclear is facing is, aside from the climate change impacts, it has more similarity to fossil fuels, because it's basically it's an existing conventional technology, there are still a lot of these environmental impacts that are under question. And then some of the arguments related, for example, to societal benefits were like job creation. They were quite similar with nuclear and fossil fuels. So we had a few of those investments, but we didn't look at those. Like if you, I know there's some studies that have looked at nuclear technologies in more particular through this kind of legitimacy lens, but we didn't focus on that so much in this study.
Yeah, because I've been reading some studies, for example, that shows that if when people get more familiar with the actual, like with the mechanical parts of the nuclear power, how it functions, for example, like heating water and driving a turbine, and this is just similar to other technologies, people become more acceptant of that, like when in experimental settings.
Yeah.
And, so it was a bit interesting that you can use kind of those familiarity issues with new technology. So that was just kind of something that was kind of a bit interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel. I think that actually connects to one of the things that I thought about, and I thought about it as well in relation to Hanna's project, because I know she's also looking, because a lot of shipping firms, at least in the west coast of Sweden, they are working with LNG as a new type of fuel. And I think that you talked a bit about this when you did your presentation. I wrote it down as a bridging technology. And I also know that you mentioned this fossil technologies, and that it was the best or cleanest coal, or what was it? Clean coal.
Clean coal.
And I thought, and I wondered if you wanted to elaborate a bit more into, because like the rhetorics they used when they had this, did they justify them as bridging technologies, or like this first step towards something new and cleaner, or how did the energy firms work with this type of, like when you had to take several steps to reach the final goal of being renewable, and how did you treat that in your data?
I think that was I don't have now like specific quotes at hand, but I think that was in general a kind of a common way to argue. So as I said, they very much often argue that the renewable strategy is basically their future, but still that in, for example, in the near future, we need some of these new investments in fossil fuels as well. I think particularly in relation to gas-powered energy generation, that was probably the case. Because you could probably think that the legitimacy for that one is perhaps not yet as bad as the situation with coal. Like you said, it's maybe thought of a kind of as a bridging technology, although like we can question that then if you look at the relative climate impacts of, for example, renewables versus gas, that I think the investment patterns that are needed are still we can question that is the kind of role of gas, for example, in the near future, as strong as some of the utilities say, or should the renewable transition be even faster? But yeah, I think the LNG example is interesting. Obviously, like that, we didn't have that one in our data set because it was focusing on the utilities sector, but like I think LNG is interesting in the sense that there's also like in the same project that we did the study in, that was also like a multidisciplinary project, and some of the people from the engineering side were looking at these synthetic gas technologies, which might be a key way to store energy in the future, which would, that has been produced with renewables. So you can also think about the synergies between the infrastructure of, for example, natural gas, and what might be the role of this synthetic gas in the future with the renewables. So yeah, I think that's a definitely a relevant question as well.
Thank you. Is there anyone else having?
Samuli, thanks for a really interesting presentation. And I'm thinking of drawing the parallels between the energy production and the shipping industry. And from my perspective, one difference might be that energy production is something that concerns more or less everybody. Everybody gets their electricity out of the power plugs and thinks about, yeah, kind of how this energy is produced. Whereas shipping is kind of more niche thing, and it perhaps has also more positive image in the public, because when you compare the ships to the airplanes or to the trucks, ships are always kind of environmentally friendly. So then, thinking about your first study and the press releases, did you get some sense who these press releases were written for, and specifically, or who were the main audience who read those? Because I think if a shipping company would release press releases, it would mainly get read by industry insiders.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we were thinking about quite a lot in the early stages of the study. And investors are definitely like one key audience for the press releases, but also a lot of these, they get picked up by the popular media, especially when it comes to more broader investments. So therefore, we thought that also the audiences that the press releases are intended to, it's still quite a bit broader than just the investor community, that it also concerns the broader society. And therefore, that it's in the interest of the firm to also argue for example, more strongly for the societal benefits of their investments. But that might be like overall the reason that if you look at like both types of technologies, these rationalization strategies that are focused, for example, on the economics are the most prevalent.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Simon, do you have a new hand raised, or is it the old one?
It's a new. It's the same hand, but it's a new. Yeah, I want to say something, and it relates to what Adrian talked about, and this is a kind of because I've just started this project on shipping, and I have never studied that before, and energy consumption in shipping. And I was wondering, like, as a question to those people involved in shipping, what I mean in comparison to Samuli's study, what are the like kind of incentives, and what are the kind of legitimate issues around like what motivates people to reduce fuel in shipping? I mean, I've heard. For example, I've done a few interviews now with shippers and with the captains and so on, and I know that some companies, like car companies, they would require the specific amount of carbon emission. They want that reported back, so there is kind of the industry have some kind of regulations. And then I mean, I know that people talk about the costs of fuel, of course, and that differs very much because the fuel prices goes very much up and down, and in times of high prices there will be people will be motivated to save fuel, but when it's the prices of fuel is low, they are more motivated to kind of speed up the transports and things like that. So I wonder, like you guys who have been working with this issue, if you have any kind of better knowledge of this.
I don't know, maybe I could say something if you refer to like more policy instruments.
Yes, whatever, like either, yeah.
There are not like today, not climate policies for the global shipping industry. They are like energy efficient index at the global IMO level. For new ships, and they're just, I think we soon will implement also for existing ships. And I think everyone wants, like in normal, they want it to happen on a global level when it comes to carbon. But I think now, for the moment, it's mainly EU that pushes it forward, the regulation. And most likely, they will implement them either in the EU's emission trading scheme from 2022, or at least put some kind of regulation on the shipping industry. If it would be international shipping or only domestic or like internal in EU, we will know hopefully more this summer. But they're also talking about, like at least the European Parliament. They also want to address also the energy efficiency, like they have for in the car industry, to also have like emission limits for ships. So as you know, like the shipping industry is in many ways more complex, since it's so, I mean, it's like many sectors in one sector.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of, it's very interesting areas, so much going on. And I think within the next few years, I think we will see that shipping from maybe finally also will like be regulated in this. But then I think also like maybe the incentive will be small in the beginning, and maybe it's a lot on the fuel prices or the freight rates, how they vary. I mean, they have the target at IMO, they should at least decarbonize 50% until 2050.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else have any?
Yes, I could add, if you're talking about shipping companies, it's not a homogeneous group, it's a large spread. So there is, of course, a lot of companies that are forerunners. We have like Wallenius Lines that is developing a sailing ship. Stena Line is developing a battery ferry for the Denmark traffic, and so on. There is, and I think that they are not doing it because they today see they're forced by others. I think they are actually doing it because they see that in the long term, it's the right thing to do, and that if they are ahead of competition, they will probably have a good business case in the future. So, and then there's so many shipping companies out there that's not doing anything. So it's the whole range.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of similarity also what we observe with the energy utilities, that there's these forerunners definitely that seem to be having head start in investing in these renewables, and it seems now, at least in the last decade, that it paid off for them in the sense that they were able to then grow their business quite a bit through this technological base that they had already developed versus some of their competitors.
Yeah, thank you. And I will also agree with Carl. And I think this was really interesting, as you talked about, Samuli, this the global and the local thing and the financial. I will actually look into that paper even more, because we have a lot of firms in Sweden that are doing a lot of active work with these renewable or at least bridging technologies, or what we want to talk about, and they at least try to do better. So it would be really interesting to see if there are more similarities there as well in the like local or national setting of Sweden that can enable this even further.
Yeah.
But we've actually also reached 2 o'clock. And in this time of Zoom and maybe constant digital meetings, I think it would be nice to round up so that everyone have a possibility to continue with their day as well. Unless there is any pressing question that you want to post now, the final few seconds. Then I would just say a huge thank you for Samuli. Thanks so much for presenting your research. I think there is a lot of similarities and even differences, but I think it's been great to learn from a bit of a different angle on how you can tackle these energy transitions and sustainability challenges in different industries.
Yeah, thank you also a lot for your attention and your interest. And if you have any questions, like more detailed questions about these studies, please don't hesitate to contact me. And yeah, otherwise, wish you a nice spring. Or actually, it's still quite wintry in here, so I think we're in the middle of our winter still in Helsinki. I don't know how's the weather in there.
Yes, thank you so much. And also, Adrian posted a very nice thanks, and also reminded that, I mean, next month we will have another seminar on managing shipping. So we will continue with these once monthly until June. So also, if any one of you who have attended wish to have someone here presenting, please let me know, and maybe I can invite them as well. We have one slot ready for presenters.